library.
There is a moment that exists between the night and the morning that most people never see. It is not dramatic, there are no trumpets, the world outside is completely still, the streets are empty, the notifications have not started yet, the demands of other people have not yet found their way to your door, and in that stillness, something becomes possible that is nearly impossible to access at any other point in the day. You become available to yourself. This video is not about waking up at 5 in the morning. Not really. The hour is almost incidental. What this video is about is something far more fundamental, something that cuts to the heart of why so many people feel like they are living lives that happen to them, rather than lives they are actively building. It is about the difference between a life spent reacting and a life spent creating. And the reason 5 in the morning matters, the reason it has changed the trajectory of so many lives across so many different cultures and centuries, is not the hour itself, but what the hour represents. It represents a choice, a daily, deliberate, almost rebellious choice to take back the first and purest portion of your day before the world can claim it. But before we talk about mornings, we need to talk about poverty. Not just the financial kind, though we will get there. We need to talk about the kind of poverty that lives in the mind long before it manifests in the bank account. The kind that teaches a person through accumulated experience that their circumstances are fixed, that the life they were born into is the life they will live, that the distance between where they are and where they want to be is not a path to be walked, but a wall to be accepted. This kind of poverty is the most dangerous kind, because money can change, circumstances can shift, opportunities appear, but a mind that has been trained by hardship and disappointment to believe that nothing will ever be different will find a way to miss every single one of those opportunities. It will explain them away, shrink from them, or simply fail to see them at all. The man at the center of this story grew up in that kind of poverty. Not the poverty of inconvenience or mild shortage, but the grinding, humiliating kind that leaves marks on a person's sense of self that money alone cannot erase. He grew up in a household where the question was never, what do you want to be, but who do you think you are? Where ambition was treated not as a virtue, but as a form of dangerous delusion. Where the adults around him had learned, through their own defeats, that dreaming too loudly only made the fall harder. He internalized those lessons the way children always do, completely, without resistance, because children do not have the philosophical distance to evaluate the beliefs of the adults around them. They simply absorb them, the way dry earth absorbs rain, and those beliefs become the soil in which their sense of self grows. And so he grew into a young man who worked hard, because that much he had been taught, but who worked hard inside a set of invisible walls he had never consciously chosen. Walls that told him that certain things were for other people, people from different places, different families, different starting points. He cycled through jobs like people cycled through seasons, not out of laziness, but out of a lack of any coherent direction. He worked construction. He drove for a delivery company. He did warehouse shifts that started before dawn and ended when his back ached with a dull, familiar permanence. He was not a failure by any conventional measure. He showed up. He was reliable, he was honest, but he was also deeply, quietly stuck, and he knew it. That knowledge sat in his chest like a stone he had learned to breathe around. The turning point did not arrive as a thunderbolt. It did not come in the form of a mentor who saw his potential, or a lucky break that opened a door, or an inheritance that changed his material reality. It came in the form of a book, read on his phone during a lunch break in a parking lot, about the daily habits of people who had built something meaningful from nothing. And within that book, one idea lodged itself in his mind with a persistence he could not explain. The idea was simple to the point of seeming absurd. Wake up earlier than you need to. Not to get more done, not to check more boxes, but to create a space at the beginning of the day that belongs entirely to you, before obligation, before noise, before the weight of other people's needs and expectations descends on you like a net. He dismissed it at first, the way anyone might dismiss something that seems too simple to be real. He'd been waking up early his whole life for work. What was the difference? But the idea did not leave him. It circled. And eventually, out of something between curiosity and desperation, he tried it. He set his alarm for 5 in the morning. not to get ready for work, not to get ahead on tasks, simply to be awake and present before the day had been handed to him by someone else. That first morning was uncomfortable. The alarm felt violent. The dark outside the window was complete and cold. He sat at his kitchen table with a cup of coffee and genuinely did not know what to do with himself. He was so accustomed to every waking moment being oriented toward a task, a requirement, a demand, that the simple experience of unstructured time felt almost threatening, like standing in a doorway that opened to nothing. But he stayed. He sat with the discomfort. He did not reach for his phone. He did not turn on the television. He just sat. And somewhere in that sitting, something began to shift. Not dramatically, not with the force of revelation, just a quiet, almost imperceptible loosening of something that had been clenched inside him for years. He started writing, not because he had any ambition to be a writer, but because writing was the only thing he could think of to do with the thoughts that were suddenly rising to the surface without the usual noise to suppress them. He wrote about his life, about what he wanted, about what he was afraid of, about the gap between who he was and who he suspected, somewhere very deep down, he might be capable of becoming. And it was in that writing, over those early quiet mornings, that he began to see something he had never been able to see before. He began to see the architecture of his own mind, the beliefs he had inherited and never questioned, the stories he had been telling himself about what was possible and what was not, the ways in which he had been, without knowing it, a very faithful servant of the limitations that had been handed to him. Seeing something clearly does not automatically change it, but it is the irreplaceable first step. You cannot dismantle a wall you cannot see. And the 5 a.m. hour, stripped of distraction and obligation, gave him the conditions he needed to finally see his own walls. This is the first secret of the early morning that almost no one talks about. People talk about productivity, they talk about getting more done, they talk about the morning routines of successful people, the cold showers and the journaling and the reading lists. But beneath all of that, the more fundamental truth is this. The early morning is the only time in most people's lives when they are not performing for anyone. When they are not someone's employee, someone's partner, someone's parent, someone's friend, when they are, if only for an hour, just themselves. And for people who have spent their entire lives defining themselves through their usefulness to others, through their role, their function, their obligation, that hour of radical privacy can feel like meeting a stranger who turns out to be the most important person they have ever encountered. The science of this is actually quite clear, even if the way people typically talk about morning routines obscures it. Our prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain responsible for higher-order thinking, long-term planning, creative problem-solving, and the regulation of impulse, is most active in the early hours of the day before the accumulation of decision fatigue, social stress, and cognitive load that builds as the day progresses. In the morning, before the world has had a chance to spend your mental resources for you, you have access to a quality of thinking that is genuinely different from what is available to you at 2 p.m. after 8 hours of responding to other people. But it is not just neurological, it is also environmental. The world is quieter at 5 a.m. The social pressure that governs most of our waking hours, the pressure to perform, to compare, to respond, to be appropriate, to manage how we are perceived, has not yet switched on. And in that quiet, in that suspension of the social gaze, something authentic becomes possible. The voice you hear at 5 a.m., sitting alone with your thoughts, is much closer to your actual voice than the voice you use to navigate the rest of your day. For the man in this story, that authentic voice began to tell him things he had been too busy, too tired, and too afraid to hear. It told him that he was not where he wanted to be. It told him that the life he was living was not the life he would choose if he believed choosing were possible. And it told him, quietly, but with an insistence that grew stronger each morning, that he had more capacity than he had ever been given credit for, and more, far more, than he had ever given himself. That is where the real story begins. Not with the alarm clock, not with the early hour, but with what a human being discovers when they stop long enough and quiet enough to hear themselves think. There's a word that gets used constantly in conversations about personal development, and that word is mindset. It's a useful word, but it has been so thoroughly diluted by motivational content that it lost most of its actual meaning. When people say mindset, they tend to mean something vague and somewhat magical, a kind of internal attitude switch that once flipped changes everything. This is not what mindset means in practice, and it is not what changed for the man in this story. What changed was not an attitude, it was a model, a mental model of who he was and what was possible for him. And mental models do not flip like switches. They update slowly, incrementally through accumulated evidence, through experience that contradicts the existing model often enough and consistently enough that the model has to revise itself. The early morning practice was, in this sense, a daily experiment in generating contradictory evidence. Every morning that he showed up and did something with intention and discipline, he was producing data that his old mental model could not easily accommodate. The old model said, "You are not the kind of person who builds things." The morning was saying, "Watch me." And over time, the model had to change. Not because he decided to think positively, because the evidence forced an update. This is also why the specific content of what you do in your early morning matters less than the consistency of doing it. The content produces skills and knowledge. The consistency produces identity, and identity is what everything else rests on. A person who identifies as someone who shows up for themselves daily, who takes their own development seriously, who treats their own time as something worth protecting, that person makes different decisions in every area of their life than a person who does not. Not because they are trying harder, but because their decisions naturally flow from a different sense of who they are. There is something else that the early morning does for people that rarely gets mentioned because it is harder to quantify than productivity metrics or income growth. It restores a sense of authorship. Most people, most of the time, feel like something other than the author of their own lives. They feel like respondents, like characters in a story whose plot is being determined by external forces, their employer, their family, their financial situation, the relentless demand of an always-on world. And this feeling of being a respondent rather than an author is not just psychologically uncomfortable, it is corrosive. It slowly erodes the belief that what you do matters, that your choices have consequences, that you are, in any meaningful sense, in charge of anything. The early morning, because it is the one time of day when no one is making demands on you, is also the one time of day when you can feel unambiguously like an author, like someone who is acting rather than reacting. And that feeling, even in the small and humble register of a single quiet hour, seeds something important. It seeds the belief that agency is real, that you are not simply a leaf being moved by currents you cannot control, but someone with the capacity, however modest it may feel at first, to choose the direction of movement. That belief in agency is not a personality trait you either have or you don't. It is a capacity that is built through evidence, through the experience of having acted and seen consequences follow from your actions, through having made decisions, however small, and seen those decisions shape what happened next. The early morning is a laboratory for that evidence, a daily, low-stakes practice ground for the experience of intentional action and its relationship to outcome. He did not wake up one morning and decide to become a different person. He woke up morning after morning and did small things that slowly, without his fully realizing it was happening, made him one. In the next part, we are going to explore what he did with those mornings, how an hour of daily silence became the engine of a transformation that took years, but was in every meaningful sense built one morning at a time. And more importantly, we are going to explore what this means for you. Because the principles at work in his story are not specific to him. They are specific to the condition of being human in a world that is structured, often very effectively, to keep you from thinking clearly about your own life. There is a mistake that people make when they first hear about someone transforming their life through an early morning habit. The mistake is to focus on the habit itself, to think that the mechanism is the alarm clock, or the specific hour, or some mystical property of the pre-dawn darkness. And because they are focused on the mechanism, they miss the substance. They set their alarm for 5, lie awake staring at the ceiling, check their phone, and conclude that this does not work for them. They are right that what they did not work. They are wrong about why. The habit is not the thing. The habit is the container. What you put in the container is everything. For the man in this story, the first months of his early morning practice were not productive by any conventional definition. He was not learning a new language or building a business or completing an online course. He was doing something that looked from the outside like almost nothing. He was sitting. He was thinking. He was writing things down, not to share them, not to accomplish anything with them, but simply to get them out of the interior space where they had been accumulated, unexamined for years. What he was doing, though he did not have this language for it at the time, was developing a relationship with himself. And this, it turns out, is the prerequisite for everything else. Every meaningful change in a human life, every genuine transformation of circumstance or character is preceded by a change in self-understanding. You cannot build a different life on the same model of yourself. And most people never get the space, the quiet, or the solitude to update that model. They are too busy living inside it.
Let us be specific about what this self-examination looked like for him, because vagueness is the enemy of understanding here. He did not sit in lotus position and achieve transcendence. He sat at a kitchen table with bad coffee and a cheap notebook and wrote things like, "I am 34 years old and I still do not know what I am doing." And "My father told me I was not smart enough for that." And "I think about quitting my job every single day, but I do not know what I would do instead." And "I am tired in a way that sleep does not fix." These are not beautiful thoughts. They're not the thoughts of a man who has already found his way. They're the thoughts of a man who is, for the first time, honest enough with himself to look at where he actually is instead of where he would prefer to believe he is. And that honesty, ugly and uncomfortable as it was the single most valuable thing he had ever given himself. Because here is what happens when you get honest with yourself about where you are. You stop spending energy on the maintenance of a comfortable fiction. And that energy, redirected, becomes available for something else. For the man, that energy began to go toward a question he had never seriously entertained before. Not, what do I need to do to get through this week, but what do I actually want my life to look like? That question, asked seriously and answered honestly, is more disruptive than most people are prepared for, because the honest answer is rarely the safe one. The honest answer tends to reveal things that are inconvenient, desires that require risk, paths that require the abandonment of comfortable certainties, versions of yourself that are incompatible with the identity you have built and the identity that the people around you have come to expect. For him, the honest answer to that question pointed towards something he had always been too embarrassed to say out loud. He wanted to build something. He had spent his entire adult life working for other people's visions, moving other people's goods, fulfilling other people's orders. And what he wanted, at the most basic and undefended level of his wanting, was to have something that was his. Not necessarily something grand, not necessarily something that would make him famous or wealthy, though he would not have said no to either. Just something that bore his mark, something he had made. That clarity, once it arrived, changed the nature of his mornings entirely. They were no longer just quiet time. They became working time. Not the kind of work where someone else sets the agenda, but the kind where the agenda is entirely your own. He began to study, not in any formal sense. He could not afford courses and had no academic background in the thing he wanted to learn, but he had a phone and a library card and 2 hours every morning before the rest of his obligations began, and those 3 things were enough. He read about business. He watched interviews with people who had started from less than he had and built something real. He took notes. He asked himself questions. He followed threads of curiosity wherever they led, which is something the structured education system he had passed through had never really encouraged him to do. There is something important to say here about the nature of self-directed learning that most formal education misses entirely. When you learn something because a curriculum tells you to, the knowledge enters your mind as an obligation. It is associated with the stress of evaluation, with the fear of failure, with the social dynamics of a classroom where being wrong in public is costly. When you learn something because your own curiosity is pulling you toward it, in the early morning quiet where no one is watching and no one is grading you, the knowledge enters your mind as something else entirely. It enters as food, as something your actual self was hungry for. And food taken in hunger is metabolized very differently than food eaten under compulsion. He was learning fast, faster than he had ever learned anything in school, not because he was suddenly smarter, but because he was finally motivated by something real, by his own vision, by the question of what his actual life could look like if he applied what he was learning to a concrete attempt to build something. The thing he decided to build was modest. It was not a tech startup or a global brand. It was a small service business in his area doing something he already knew how to do from years of manual work, but doing it as the owner rather than the employee. The margins were not glamorous, the initial scale was tiny, but it was his. And the experience of building something that was his, of making decisions that mattered in a context he owned and was accountable for, did something to him that no paycheck from someone else's company had ever come close to doing. It woke him up in a way that was entirely distinct from the alarm clock at 5 a.m. and far more fundamental. It woke up a part of him that had been sleeping since childhood, since the years when the adults around him had, with the best intentions and the heaviest possible hands, taught him to keep his head down and his expectations small. But here is where the story becomes instructive in a way that goes beyond the individual. Because what he built in those early morning hours was not just a business, he was building a capacity. The capacity for self-directed effort, the capacity for sitting with discomfort without flinching from it, the capacity to sustain a commitment over time in the absence of external validation or accountability. These are not small things. In fact, they're arguably the core competencies of any meaningful human achievement, and they are competencies that most environments, most schools, most jobs, and most social circles do almost nothing to develop. The early morning hour, precisely because it is stripped of those external structures, becomes a kind of training ground for them. Every morning that you show up when you do not have to, every morning that you do the work when no one is watching, every morning that you choose your long-term vision over the short-term comfort of staying in bed, you are making a deposit into an account that the visible world cannot see, but that your life will eventually be built from. There's a concept in psychology called self-efficacy, developed by the psychologist Albert Bandura, which refers to a person's belief in their own capacity to execute the actions required to achieve a specific outcome. It is distinct from self-esteem, which is a more general sense of self-worth. Self-efficacy is specific. It is the felt sense that you can actually do the thing. And it does not come from being told you are capable. It comes from the accumulated evidence of having done things, small things at first, things that build on each other, things that demonstrate to your own nervous system that you are someone who does what they say they will do. The man's early mornings were self-efficacy training. Every morning he woke up when the alarm said to wake up, he was providing himself with evidence. Every morning he sat with his notebook and his thoughts. Instead of reaching for distraction, he was building proof. Every morning he did the work on the thing he was building. Without knowing for certain that it would succeed, he was accumulating a body of evidence that said, I am someone who does this. And that body of evidence, invisible to everyone else, was the most important thing he owned. Here, it is worth pausing to address something that the productivity-focused framing of morning routines almost always misses. The man's mornings were not, in the main, spent on tasks. They were not lists of things to accomplish before 7 in the morning. They were, at their best, something closer to a conversation, a long, slow, ongoing conversation between the person he had learned to perform for the world and the person he actually was when no performance was required. Most of us carry a significant gap between those two people, the performed self and the actual self.
The performed self knows how to navigate social expectations, how to give acceptable answers to the question of how are you doing, how to seem competent and together and fine. The actual self knows other things. It knows what it is tired of, what it is afraid of, what it genuinely wants beneath the layers of should and supposed to and realistic. And it is the actual self that has to be consulted if you want to build something real. Because a life built entirely on the preferences of the performed self is, at best, a comfortable approximation of a life. At worst, it is a very long, very sophisticated kind of performance for an audience that will never fully satisfy you, because they are applauding something that is not quite you. The mornings gave him access to his actual self. Not immediately, and not without friction. The actual self does not emerge easily after years of suppression. It comes out slowly, sideways, in thoughts that feel strange or embarrassing or too large to say aloud, in desires that do not fit the available categories, in resistances and resentments and longings that do not come with clear instructions about what to do with them. But it comes. Given enough quiet and enough consistency, it comes. And when it does, when you finally have enough contact with the actual self to know something real about what it wants and what it is capable of, you have something that no external circumstance can give you and no external circumstance can take away. You have a compass. It would be dishonest to tell you that his path was smooth from this point. It was not. There were mornings he did not wake up, weeks where the discipline collapsed under the weight of exhaustion or discouragement, or the ordinary entropy that erodes every human project that is not defended with vigilance. There were months where the business struggled in ways that made him question whether he was fooling himself, whether the comfortable certainties he had abandoned for this uncertain path had been more sensible than he had given them credit for. But something had changed that could not be unchanged. He had seen himself differently. He had spent enough mornings alone with the honest, undefended version of himself to know that the life he had been living before was not a life he had chosen. And once you know that, you cannot unknow it. The comfortable resignation that had once been available to him was gone. Not because he had become someone who did not fear failure. He was afraid of failure every single day. But because he had become, through those mornings, someone who was more afraid of never trying than of trying and falling short. Something else happened during those difficult stretches that runs counter to most of what the self-help world tends to say. During the hardest months, when the business was struggling and the doubts were loudest, he did not try to manufacture motivation. He did not listen to pump-up speeches or recite affirmations in the mirror. He did something quieter and considerably more useful. He returned to the original question that his first mornings had helped him find. Not, am I going to succeed, but what do I actually want, and is what I am doing aligned with that? That question, asked with honesty in the pre-dawn silence, is self-correcting in a way that external motivation is never able to be. External motivation tells you to keep going, regardless of direction. The honest question tells you whether the direction is right. And sometimes it told him to adjust, to change something, to drop what was not working in favor of something that had a better chance. The morning practice was not just a space for effort, it was a space for discernment, for the kind of clear-eyed assessment of where you are and whether it is where you should be, the kind of assessment that is nearly impossible when you are caught in the reactive current of a fully scheduled day. There is a reason why the most significant decisions in many people's lives tend to come from what feels like nowhere. The decision to leave a relationship, to change careers, to make a commitment that changes everything. They seem to come from nowhere because they were made in a rare moment of quiet, when the noise dropped and the person was suddenly able to hear what they had been telling themselves all along. The early morning practice does not manufacture those moments, it makes them regular. It makes them a daily occurrence rather than a lucky accident. And that regularity is the difference between a life that is occasionally clarified and a life that is continuously oriented. That shift from fear of failure to fear of unlived potential is perhaps the most profound transformation the early morning practice made possible. and it is a transformation that is available to anyone willing to sit in the dark long enough to hear themselves think. We live in a culture that is deeply seduced by the idea of the turning point, the moment of transformation, the single decision, the key conversation, the dramatic event that divides a life into before and after. We tell stories this way because it makes for better narrative. It is more satisfying to hear that something changed everything than to hear the truth, which is that almost nothing changes everything, and most meaningful transformation is the result of something far less cinematic. It is the result of small actions, repeated with consistency over long stretches of time, in the absence of any visible reward. This is the part of the story that is hardest to tell well, not because it is complicated, but because it is slow, because it asks of the listener something that our current culture is genuinely bad at asking for, which is patience. The patience to believe that things that cannot yet be seen are nonetheless being built. The patience to continue showing up before the results are visible. The patience to trust the process, not as a slogan, but as a real, lived practice of daily commitment in the face of daily uncertainty. The man's life did not transform in a month. It did not transform in a year. The first year of his early morning practice produced in external terms almost nothing that anyone could have pointed to and said, "Look, that is different now." He had more clarity, he had more direction, he had a nascent business that was generating a small amount of money, but nothing that justified by any rational economic calculus the risk and effort he was putting into it. And he had a daily practice of showing up for himself before the world could show up for him. What that first year produced that mattered was invisible. It produced a different nervous system, a different relationship with difficulty, a different baseline expectation of what was possible. And those invisible changes were the foundation on which everything visible would later be built. By the end of the second year, the business was sustainable. Not comfortable, but sustainable. He had clients he had earned rather than been assigned. He had made decisions that had worked and decisions that had failed, and he had learned from both in the way that you only learn from things you were genuinely accountable for. He had hired one person, then two. He had begun to see in the daily reality of running something that the skills he had always assumed were beyond him were in fact skills. Learnable, practicable, improvable skills. Not talents you were born with or denied at birth. Skills you built through repetition and reflection and the willingness to be wrong on your way to being right. By the end of the third year, his income had exceeded what he had ever made working for someone else. This is the moment in the story where it would be tempting to declare victory, to say, "And this is what the 5 o'clock alarm gave him." But that would be to miss the point entirely. Because the money, though genuinely meaningful and genuinely the result of real work and real growth, was not what had changed. What had changed was the person, and the person had changed long before the money reflected it. Let us talk about that change at a more granular level, because it is the most instructive part of the story. He had, over those years of early mornings, developed several capacities that he had not possessed when he began. And these capacities are worth naming precisely because they are transferable. They are not specific to him or to his particular journey. They are the capacities that any person develops when they commit to a daily practice of showing up for their own life with intention. The first capacity was clarity. Not the clarity of having all the answers, but the clarity of knowing the right questions, knowing what actually matters to you as opposed to what you've been told should matter. Knowing what you are working towards and why. Knowing the difference between the discomfort that signals growth and the discomfort that signals you are going in the wrong direction. This sounds simple. It is not. Most people live their entire lives without this kind of clarity. They operate on autopilot, following social scripts and inherited expectations, and they only discover the absence of clarity when it is very late and the costs of changing course are very high.
Now, the second capacity was tolerance for uncertainty. When he began his mornings, he was someone who needed the known quantity, who stayed in jobs that frustrated him because the paycheck was reliable, who avoided risk not because he was cowardly, but because uncertainty felt genuinely unbearable.
The early morning practice, paradoxically, helped him build a tolerance for uncertainty by making him more certain of himself. Not certain that things would work out, certain that he could handle it if they did not. Those are very different things, and the second is far more useful. The third capacity was what the philosopher and essayist Ralph Waldo Emerson called self-reliance, a quality that has nothing to do with not needing other people and everything to do with having an internal compass that does not require constant external validation to function. The early morning hour, by its nature, is an exercise in self-reliance. No one is watching, no one is encouraging, no one is telling you that you're on the right track. You have only your own judgment to go on. And in exercising that judgment day after day in the privacy of the pre-dawn silence, you build the muscle of trusting it. The fourth capacity, and perhaps the most practically consequential, was long-term thinking. One of the defining characteristics of poverty, and this has been documented extensively in behavioral economics, is its tendency to produce short-term thinking. Not because people living in poverty are less intelligent or less disciplined than people who are not, but because scarcity itself narrows cognitive focus. When you are operating under conditions of genuine material shortage, your brain allocates its resources toward immediate threat management. There is simply less bandwidth available for considering what life might look like in 5 years. The early morning practice, by carving out a protected space for reflection that was explicitly not about immediate crisis management, gradually expanded his time horizon. He began to think not just about next week, but about next year, about 5 years, about the accumulation of small daily decisions would produce over a decade. That shift in time horizon is transformative in ways that are difficult to overstate, because almost every meaningful improvement in a human life is the result of decisions whose benefits are not immediately visible. The decision to study something useful before it is needed, the decision to build relationships before you need them, the decision to save money you could spend, the decision to invest in your own growth before anyone is paying you for the growth you have already achieved. None of these decisions make obvious sense from a short-term perspective. They all make overwhelming sense from a long-term one, and they are only accessible to someone who has expanded their relationship with time. Now, let us talk about you, because the story of one man is only worth telling if it illuminates something about the human condition more broadly. And what it illuminates, I want to argue, is this. The obstacle between most people and the life they are capable of living is not primarily a resource problem. It is not that they lack the intelligence, the talent, the opportunity, or even the time. The obstacle is attention. Specifically, it is the absence of a protected space in which their attention belongs entirely to themselves and to the question of what they are doing with their one life. The world is extraordinarily good at colonizing your attention. From the moment your phone's notifications begin in the morning to the moment you fall asleep with the television still on, there is an almost unbroken chain of external demands on your cognitive and emotional resources. This is not accidental. Enormous industries are built on the capture of your attention. And the people whose attention is most thoroughly captured are those who have the least protected time, who are the most exhausted, the most financially pressured, the most socially obligated. In other words, the people for whom a protected space for self-directed thinking would be most valuable are precisely the people who are least likely to have one. The 5 in the morning habit, or whatever equivalent you choose to give it, is an act of reclamation. It is the decision to take back a portion of your attention before anyone else can claim it. To use that attention not on consumption, but on creation. Not on reacting to what the world is doing, but on thinking clearly about what you want to do. It doesn't have to be 5 in the morning. The specific hour is less important than the principle. The principle is that you need time that is yours, genuinely, structurally, unarguably yours. Time that is not borrowed from sleep, not stolen from obligations, not contingent on everyone else being taken care of first. Time that you have decided in advance and with commitment belongs to you and to the work of building your own life. Before some people, that time is early morning. For others, it is late at night. For others still, it is the middle of the day, a lunch hour fiercely defended against social and professional encroachment. The hour matters less than the consistency. The consistency matters less than the intention. And the intention that matters is this.
In this time, I am not performing for anyone. I am not being useful for anyone. I am thinking clearly about who I am and what I am building, and I am doing the work that only I can do on the life that is mine to live. The man whose story began this video is not exceptional. This is not a false modesty intended to make you feel better about yourself. It is a statement of fact that matters. He did not have unusual intelligence. He did not have advantages that you lack. He did not get lucky in any way that explains what happened to him. What he had was an idea planted in him by a book read in a parking lot that something could be different. And he had the willingness to test that idea every single morning in the dark before anyone was watching.
Let us also speak honestly about failure, because any honest account of what it looks like to build a life through the accumulation of daily mornings has to reckon with the fact that most mornings do not feel significant. Most mornings feel ordinary. You sit down, you do your work, or your thinking, or your learning, and nothing dramatic happens. The insight does not arrive. The breakthrough does not occur. You close the notebook or shut the laptop and go about the rest of your day with no visible evidence that anything meaningful took place. And then you do it again the next morning, and the morning after that, and you begin to wonder, as anyone would, whether this is a practice or a delusion. This is the moment where most people stop. Not because they have decided the practice is worthless, but because the absence of visible results activates a very deep and very human fear, the fear of wasted effort, of being the kind of person who invests in things that do not pay off, of looking in retrospect like someone who was foolish enough to keep watering a seed that was never going to grow. What gets people through this moment when it comes is not optimism. Optimism is too fragile a thing to sustain long-term practice through the months when evidence is scarce. What gets people through is something more structural. It is a commitment to the process that is independent of any particular outcome, a decision made in advance and revisited regularly that the practice is valuable not because of what it will produce, but because of what it is. Because showing up for yourself daily in the quiet is the right relationship to have with your own life regardless of whether it produces visible results on any given timeline. That is a harder thing to hold on to than it sounds. Our culture is relentlessly outcome-oriented. We measure value by results. We evaluate habits by whether they produce the promised transformation on the expected schedule. And when they do not, we conclude that we have failed, or that the habit was wrong, or that we are not the kind of person for whom this kind of thing works. Very rarely do we conclude the one thing that is most often true, which is that we stopped too soon. The compound interest of daily intention is one of the most underestimated forces in human life. We understand compound interest when it applies to money. We understand that small amounts, invested consistently over long periods, grow into things that dwarf any single large investment could have produced. We understand this intellectually. We do not often apply it to our own daily choices. We do not often think about what happens when a person chooses, every single morning for 5 years, to invest 30 minutes in their own clarity, their own vision, their own growth. We do not often calculate what the return on that investment looks like at year 3, year 5, year 10. But it is calculable, not in the precise mathematical sense, but in the observable, lived sense. The return on that investment is a different person, a person who knows themselves better, who trusts themselves more, who has built through daily practice the capacity to sustain effort over time in the absence of immediate reward, who has a clearer idea of what they are working toward and why, who has slowly and without fanfare become someone their younger self would have had difficulty imagining. That is what 5 in the morning gave one man. Not money, though money came, not success, though success followed. It gave him himself. It gave him the space to discover who he was when the noise stopped and the obligations receded and the only voice in the room was his own. And what he found there in that quiet was not a man who was resigned to the life he had been handed. It was a man who was ready, finally, to build something different. There is one more dimension of this story that deserves to be addressed, because it is the dimension that most directly meets the skepticism this kind of story tends to generate. The skepticism that says, this is fine for him, but my situation is different. My constraints are real. My obligations are not negotiable. I do not have the luxury of protecting an hour of my morning for myself when there are children to get ready, bills to manage, and a job that starts at 7. This skepticism is legitimate. The constraints are real.
I want to be clear that nothing in this video suggests that waking up early is a magic solution that renders circumstances irrelevant. Circumstances are never irrelevant. What genuine material scarcity, what the kind of structural disadvantage that is not a mindset problem, what those circumstances do is they narrow options. They impose real costs on certain choices. They foreclose certain paths. All of this is true and worth saying plainly. But here's what is also true. The absence of a protected space for self-directed thinking does not merely maintain your circumstances, it actively makes them harder to change. Because the changes that would improve your circumstances require something that circumstances cannot give you. They require clarity about what you are trying to change and why and how. They require sustained effort on something over time in the absence of immediate reward. They require the self-knowledge and self-trust that can only be built through regular, honest engagement with your own inner life. None of those things happen automatically. None of them happen in the spaces left over after everything else has been attended to. They have to be chosen, deliberately and in advance, against the very understandable resistance of exhaustion and obligation. The man in this story was not less tired than you. He was not less obligated. He was not working with resources you do not have access to. He made a choice about where his first hour went before the rest of the day could make that choice for him. And then he made it again the next morning and the morning after that. Not because it was easy, because he had decided, based on the evidence of a few honest mornings alone with himself, that the version of his life he was living was not the only version available. The alarm is not the answer. You are. But sometimes the alarm is what gives you the conditions to remember that. Set it. Show up. Stay. Do the work. And trust the compounding of small mornings to do what large ambitions and grand gestures never quite manage, to quietly, invisibly, irreversibly change everything.